Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Everyone had a really good lunch? Well fed and watered? Ready for the afternoon? So what we're going to do is just dive into the afternoon's presentation. I have the unenviable task of keeping you awake despite your ethnic fatigue that is probably kicking in right now. So just to introduce myself, because you all have been hearing a lot about me, I am Vashti, Maharaj-Adviser on digital trade, and I work with the TUNR team at the Commonwealth Secretariat. So without more, I'm going to move into the presentation this afternoon on data protection and cross-border data flows. For just my presentation, I have a question. Everyone has their phone or laptop with them? Show me by the raise of hands, because I'll need for you all to show me proof of life for the point of my presentation. It's very, very important. So without more, part of the digital economy, and as it comes to trade, as we move to the element of trade, you're going to find that cross-border trade, it refers to the movement of personal data from one country to the other and across international borders. And that is basically the crux of digital trade. Trade in this digital age, including not e-commerce, because that's now digital economy, as the Attorney General has pointed out, that's superannuated. It demands seamless cross-border exchange of data in order to move goods and cargo and even services across the globe, of which the Caribbean is a very integral part. The rapid advances in digitalization means that we have a lot of technology tools at our hands. We have AI, machine learning, cloud computing, robotics, and it therefore means that as part of this trade value chain, there's more and more and more data that is generated. Because do you know that the more developed a country is and the younger its population, the more data is produced. And you find that particularly in the aftermath of the global pandemic, even if you had an aversion to shopping online, it now became your mainstay. So in light of that, businesses have an increased reliance on cross-border exchange of personal data to develop and sell new products. When you buy something, even when companies purchase things, from beginning to end, it involves the mass movement of personal data across that value chain to allow for a transaction to be completed. This naturally has led to a lot of data, and I know we all talk about big data and using big data for good, but we're looking at it in the context of global trade and how that can be harnessed and how member states within the Caribbean are actually dealing with cross-border data flows. Do you think we're dealing with it really well? Oh, well, there you go. So it means that it's not just a game changer for the large companies, but particularly during the pandemic, you would have found that smaller companies as SMEs are able to overcome informational disadvantages and reduce barriers by enhancing or taking advantage of data analytics and using data within their business. But you find that in light of this, and I can say this as a career person with a legal background, you'd find that the legislation always follows technology. We're never in front, we're always behind. And when it comes to trade and the increasing volume of trade across international borders, it is a question to ask, what has been the government's reaction? Have our laws in relation to cross-border data flows also been kept up to date? Have we been able to keep abreast and sufficiently enhance and harness this trend within the Caribbean? And the answer is that there are lots of concerns, and I'm not going to preempt the wonderful discussions that are going to take place by my colleague in relation to fair competition and consumer protection, as well as cyber. But the cross-border data transfer, in as much as it's the lifeblood of digital trade, because you can't buy anything online without entering your data, it has given rise to concerns about the effects of information being collected and used, often without the knowledge of data subjects. So that being said, there have been issues, and I'm sure all of you are all too familiar with these issues within your everyday interactions, within your businesses and governments, relating to privacy and personal data protection, access to information for audit purposes, national security, and how to develop domestic digital industries while still creating a liberalized environment for data flows. So within the Caribbean, data protection laws present a varying degree of restrictiveness. So when I say a varying degree of restrictiveness, when we look at cross-border data flows, a country itself can take a policy position as to how it's going to deal with data that comes in, that is generated in its borders, and leaves its borders. Some countries take a very protectionist view. Some countries are like, let it flow. We want to encourage businesses to, have access to data, and we want to encourage big data and AI, data-driven sort of industry. And then you have countries that are insistent on data localization, and we must know everything that is happening because this is our data and this is our gold, and we have to mine it first, or use it, or control it. So that being said, we're just going to do an overview of what are the different approaches that you can take and generally are taken across the board internationally. You would see from this diagram, there's no regulation, and you'd be pleased to know that the Caribbean has not been left behind. There is still no regulation in some jurisdictions. And free flow is where there may be no regulation or there's regulation and it does not speak to cross-border data transfers. And in my analysis of the Caribbean legislation, which we'll get to very shortly, you'll find that some of the data protection legislation is very nascent. It's been there in the books since very early 2000s, when we were now addressing data protection and its need to protect the data, but it is now 2022. And they may not have contemplated down the road how important the element of cross-border data flow would have been with regard to trade and commerce within the Caribbean. So they may have been silent on that, and therefore they will fall under free flow. Then there's the flow of data on conditional safeguards. And conditional safeguards vary across the Caribbean and internationally. Those safeguards could mean that the other country has to have equivalent laws, or those safeguards may be that the person has to consent for their data to leave the jurisdiction, or it may be that there must be contractual guarantees that allow for that data to move. You must consent to it. And the liability is passed on to who is sending the data out, interestingly enough, which we will get to just now. And then there is the ultimate, which is flow conditional and ad hoc authorization. It is the most restrictive form that you can take. And believe it or not, some countries in the world take this approach and advocate this approach because they indicate that this provides the best level of confidence and trust by private sector entities. At the end of the day, it is always a national policy decision that needs to be taken as to what is the best fit for your jurisdiction. And in looking at the Caribbean, you will find that clearly that's happening, because we have a speckled, varying approach with regard to cross-border data flows. So on the free flow, it is just that, free flow. It is the least restrictive. And this also pertains to countries that have no specific data protection laws. While this implies that there are no restrictions on movement of data, this is actually more of a curse and a blessing sometimes when it comes to global international trade. And I'm sure you can guess the reason why. The reason why is that the absence of regulation precludes the willingness of other countries that have legislation to send their data to you, because they're not too sure what will happen to that personal information or transactional data when it is can be a barrier to cross-border data flows. On the second one, which is conditional safeguard, and this is like the middle, this is like towing the middle here. where you have a Data Protection Act, you have something in place that says, okay, we understand that data is going to leave our country, but it can only leave under these specific conditions. And these safeguards include the requirement that the laws up, and in many instances, you will find that this requires an equivalency determination by your regulator, which is your Information Commissioner. How many of your countries have an Information Commissioner instituted? Can you show me by the raise of hands? That's 1, 2. What country would that be? Can we get a round of applause for Barbados? Yay! Cayman Islands is in the room. I think they have theirs. Bermuda has theirs. Jamaica has theirs. So in many instances, your Information Commissioner plays a very integral role if you have flow conditional and safeguards, because they will need to make an equivalency determination. They will do an analysis or assessment and say this country has equivalent protections and therefore they have an adequacy assessment and they will authorize the flow of data, which is very important. Do you want to know a fun fact about the Caribbean? A lot of jurisdictions, when I put up my table, because I spent a whole night reading all your laws, a lot of the countries provide for an Information Commissioner's office, an ombudsman's office, or a tribunal even. So it's there. Do you know how many have set up their offices? And it is questionable, because what happens if it is that you have the legislation that provides for flow conditional and safeguards? So you're allowed to move your data out, but your Information Commissioner has to give you an adequacy assessment, and you don't have an Information Commissioner. Does that put you back onto open access? It's a very interesting thought, because at the end of the day, you're saying your country's legislation allows for cross-border data flows because we're big on trade and we're like winning it. But in reality, if you don't put in place the necessary provisions that is provided in your legislation, you actually put yourself at the back foot, back to the first position, which is free flow, technically. And that affects multinational trading, because multinational companies such as the big ones, the big tech companies, they have to comply with GDPR regulations, and they need adequacy in the countries that they're trading with. So by having the legislation, that's one step. But putting in place the protections is what they actually need to show in order to let that data come to your jurisdiction. It's a very important fact to note. So flow conditional and ad hoc authorization is like the upper end. That's the highest end of restriction where, and you find, believe it or not, a lot of countries, when I was doing my assessment of COMESA member states, some of them actually take this approach. But because they operate as a trading bloc and have similar provisions, it does not preclude global trade. It actually enhances it. And this is a food for thought. And not just in what is the best model, but what is the best model that will work for your region. Because no country is a standalone country when it comes to data flows. You have to think of where the data is flowing to. What do they have in place? Will it bounce back like a force field because they can't accept it? This is all part of our Caribbean discourse that we need to take in mind. When it comes to data protection and the movement of information, know that you cannot draft your country's laws in a vacuum or within a silo. You have to think of your trading partners and what's the impact upon the economy of the data protection law. So back to Egypt. So this is the most, I would say, stringent, where an adequacy finding is required by the relevant public authority, and where it is not granted, it's not possible to transfer data. Given the time and cost to obtain permission from the government authority, such laws are more restrictive to cross-border data movement. However, firms might feel comfortable to transfer data only where there's prior approval by the government, making cross-border trade thrive. under the most restrictive laws, but that is within the context of the regional trading bloc. That being said, everybody, this is your time to shine and give me feedback. I've been talking to you all about data protection and what it can do for you. So I'd like you to get on your phone or your laptop and go to menti.com and use this code. And IT, if you can put up the presentation screen. So the question is, what do you think is the most widely used model for cross-border data flows in the Caribbean? What do you think we use across the Caribbean? Is it free flow, conditional on safeguards, or conditional with ad hoc authorization? You are the people. These are your laws. Oh, free flow. Interesting. On paper or in reality? On paper. But in reality. Good question. So come on, let's go. I know how much of you all in the room. I know how much of you all are online. I know some of you all are lawyers. Let's stop pretending we're not. All right. A lot of people think we're free flow just because it's carnival season. All right. Okay. Interesting. Nobody thinks about flow conditional ad hoc. All right, there's one person. All right, that's interesting. You know, I should have walked with my bag of chocolates for the right answer. Tomorrow it is Valentine's. All right, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Any more takers? Let's see who got it right. Because I actually did my research last night. I have the right answer. I have the right answer. Okay. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds for those who haven't to complete. Is this your last answer? Last call. And so you think, and from these answers, the most widely used model for cross-border data flows in the Caribbean would be flow conditional and safeguards. Is this your final answer? All right, for the money, let's go back to my presentation, see if you're right. And the answer is flow with safeguards. Yay! Give yourself a round of applause. So what happens is that this is a snapshot of the data protection legislation, but just the provisions that relate to cross-border flow of information. And I will tell you something about doing this research. It was not just about free flow is for the ones that don't have the legislation, but you found that flow with safeguards was a very tricky category because no one country had the same clause or provision. Some of them had different requirements, and even some of them had a mix of flow with safeguards, but still the Information Commissioner has to say yes. Now imagine being a trading partner with the Caribbean. Would you be fairly confused at this point in time? I just want to trade with the entire Caribbean and I need your information and I need to have some sort of uniformity to understand how to navigate this Caribbean market. So this is a very telling tale about where we're at for Caribbean group with regard to cross-border data flows. And though cross-border data transfer regulatory objectives are not meant to regulate international trade, they have substantial unintended trade consequences, especially when they restrict the movement of data that is critical for the coordination of global value chains. And you would also find that heterogeneity, where you have a mixed bag of data protection regulation. So if I want to do business with the Caribbean, I have to figure out what each jurisdiction has as a requirement, because it's not one and the same. Heterogeneity and restrictiveness and the absence of regulation laws in some Caribbean states create uncertainty in regional data flows. And regional harmonization of data flow regulations, I'm not saying that that's the panacea, because the truth is it's easier said than done. Come on, Caribbean, we know this. But what happens is that I'm not advocating that we all need to regionally harmonize our laws and it needs to be the same. What you find is that studies in other jurisdictions have shown that it tends to reduce compliance costs and boost in regional trade, and there's a positive nexus between international cross-border data flow agreements, both in trade in goods and services. So what's the takeaway? As I said, I'm going to be the shortest and hopefully the best presentation for today. So what is our takeaway? What do we come away thinking? And this presentation is very short because it's cross-cutting with the discussion on Caribbean harmonization tomorrow, on standards, as well as cybersecurity. So I'm just actually putting it out there for you to think and take away and come back with more questions. There's no one size fits all, as the Honorable Attorney General for Barbados said this morning. There isn't one answer, and you can't expect everyone to come up with the same laws. It is based on your economic circumstances. What is your national policy directive that influences your laws? However, there are many gains. You don't have to go for harmonization. You could go for the quick wins. And my colleagues tomorrow will speak about the importance of standardization, which is another level that is equally important. There are many gains that can be derived from adopting common principles and standards in the development of your legal framework. It doesn't have to be the same, but it has to be sufficiently wide to allow for that regional and international trade to be conducive. And also, one of the other things we observed in our work across the Commonwealth jurisdictions is that in addition to your data protection laws, legal frameworks can be supplemented by mutual regional agreements. And as a Caribbean, we are very well poised to take advantage of that situation, because when you have MRAs, it's easier to allow for data flows because there's agreements between governments as to how this will occur. And this is certainly an avenue that can be maximized within the CARICOM region as a whole. So on that note, that's the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be quite happy to take them now. If not, I'd be happy to move on to the next presentation too. Any questions? Yes, Chris.
That was a really interesting diagram you had with all the different legal systems all lined up. I mean, what does success look like? Are we all, I say we, but I mean, is everybody meant to be in the left-hand side?
Success looks like everybody has something in place in the first instance.
Yeah.
But I think greater success would be where what we have in place is in alignment. It doesn't have to be the exact same thing, but there's a common principled basis or common standards. So when you deal with the Caribbean as a whole, your data is not going to stop from one country to the other, but you can have the seamless movement, because within a globalized trade environment, that is what is required. And the economic gains that can be derived from that, as my senior director had pointed out very early this morning when we were all fresh and had our coffee, was that, the added value of legal reform to allow for frameworks to allow for cross-border trade can accrue great economic benefits across the Commonwealth, 1.3 trillion by 2030. All right. Yes.
This one is working. You all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vashti. I just want to comment on something that Vashti was talking about with the harmonization, and even in her other place, when she was in the Office of the Attorney General back home by us, when we were working on data protection legislation and so forth, you would find that Trinidad and Tobago, our CPC department, will work a lot with other regional countries to look at harmonization of our legislation, so that when it's time for enforcement, we're not bouncing and bumping heads with each other from policy, come straight into legislation. So, and I know sometimes that's a little bit of a ticklish situation when your law says something else and then ours says, and we do something else. So when Vashti speaks to harmonization, and she was answering Chris just now, I think that having that balance within our region helps us to move forward together in data sharing, especially too when it comes to mutual legal assistance.
Yes.
And yes, the NRA, as you spoke about. Well done, Vashti.
Thank you. Divya, please no hard questions now.
Nope. I want to toot my own horn. So I'm representing CARICOM, Competition Commission, and we are one agency under the wider revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which alleges to bring together certain member states of the Caribbean. And it is alleging that it wants to promote economic integration. We are facing global economies. We have less than 6 or 7 million in the Caribbean as a whole. So when Vashti says 1.3 trillion in the Commonwealth, as a Caribbean, we are literally a little teeny tiny bird flying in a big wide sea. So when it comes to data, and when she says that the youngest group creates most of the data, yes, even last week I was on a website and it asked me my birthday, and over 20 years legal experience. And guess what? I just put in my birth date, and afterwards I'm sitting down like, did I really need this article so bad? But this is what we're facing. There are cross-border flows and it directly impacts trade. Individually, we are unable to trade. And well, in my own discussion, you will see the competition issues. But when we talk about regionalization, we do need, through CCC, through CTU, and through the CARICOM Secretariat, to sit down and start seriously having discussions on this aspect so that we have a game plan for the region. So even though our legislation may not be filled with sameness, we have a certain comparability and reciprocity that other trading blocs will meet and enjoy, and likewise, so will we when we go into multilateral negotiations. So I think that is just the one thing, Vashti, that I wanted to bring out from my side, that yes, we can have individual pieces of legislation, but if our pieces of legislation come together because it is tied to something in the RTC or another protocol that we have all agreed, we have more weight on the international arena to demand the rights for our own consumers, our own businesses, and our own sovereign nations. So that's it. Thank you, and thank you for a very entertaining and educational presentation.
Thank you, Nivea. I really appreciate your always very insightful comments. On that note, if we have no further questions, I just want to introduce the last person who made a comment as your next speaker. So if you can put up her bio, I'd like to introduce to you Ms. Nivea Ramsundar, who currently holds the position of Executive Director, Chief Executive Officer of the CARICOM Competition Commission, which is located in Suriname. She's an attorney at law with over 20 years practice and has worked in telecommunications and broadcasting law, regulation, competition. Her current work mainly focuses on ensuring economic integration within CSME, and without more, I'll hand it over to Nivea. Thank you.
Lunch was really, really good. So can I ask you all to stand up for one quick second? Just 1 second. I know that you look at me and you think I'm not going to make you do this, but I will. Just stand up really, Chris. Just stand up. And just really just stand up on your toes and just take a really deep breath and just stretch up. Blow out everything Vashti just said. Breathe in everything Nivea is going to say, and breathe it out again. Okay, good. So we're feeling all right? Now, you know, I really hate these things. I prefer a loose mic. Are y'all still hearing me? Okay. Now, I'm not an economist, I'm going to be turning paper. I have real things to tell all you. I have real things to say. But the thing is that, pick it up now, pull it up for me. I'm going to put on these glasses so I can read my paper. So I'm not going to see you all, but I know there's a Q&A session at the end, but I have a lot to say. So if at any point you prefer to put your hand up, do it that way, so that way we will do it all in this session, and then you don't lose your train of thought, and also I don't lose my train of thought. The thing is that this particular presentation on competition, I'll take you through a very brief anatomy. Some of you know the anatomy of a DE, some of you don't. We'll look at some basics of competition, and then we'll go down to concerns and readiness. And I'm giving you fair warning, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an economist. I had too much fish cash. And it's not something that I enjoy, but I think it is something you need to know, because from a competition perspective, what we do is assess economics. We assess market, we assess what goes wrong, and then we say, okay, let's see how we can help it. Now, I want you to just look at this particular diagram, and I'll talk it out. And Vashti will, of course, give you the presentations. I was hoping you all would have it on your email already. Now, if you look at the center there, there's a core, that's the ICT center. And traditionally, this core, remember the Barbados AG referred to computer misuse? This is how small developing nations and a lot of the early 2000s saw a digital economy. IT, ICT, how to build computers and how to hack them. That's how we saw it. And then into the 2000s, Jeff Bezos and all these young bright boys started to do wonderful things. And then we started to say, you know what? This two-sided platform that's available in newspaper industries and all kinds of things can happen in the digital world. And it became the platform economy for digital services. Now, narrowly, Bucht and Hicks define this is what most people define platform economy as, and digital economy. The core and just that little level of services around it. We're in 2023, and it's really becoming that all those digital dividends outside there, the e-business, e-commerce, agriculture, Industry 4.0, data, all these things, that's also part of it. So very broadly, I like OECD 2020. The digital economy are economic activities which are reliant or significantly enhanced by digital inputs, and they create digital dividends. Now, if we look at this one, we're talking about an ecosystem. So it's no longer just about the computers. It's no longer just about, lend me a mic, Gary. It's no longer just about some things or other. It's not on. You want to make them fall asleep? Don't fall asleep. I keep breathing. Breathe Vashti out. Breathe me in. Now, I just want you to look real quickly. And you're going to see it on your screen lower down. I want you to understand from the perspective of a very holistic view of all that's happening, that you have people producing things in the middle. You then have platform offers happening. You have intellectual property happening. You have payments happening. You have judgments in courts. You have legislation being made. You have Samsung and all the other people fighting. Look at how detailed it is. It's an entire ecosystem. So the whole point of that is to let you know that basically the way that we do business has changed, and we no longer can view things about 10 years to take a piece of legislation, 10 years to agree that Trinidad and Antigua and Barbuda and Barbados can have the same point of view on an issue. It means that things are getting a little more heated, so we have to come together. Now, there's a little something that people talk about, and they talk about data, and they talk about cybersecurity and all kinds of things. Lurking behind all of this is the algorithm. And you're seeing Ukraine, and you're seeing things, and you're thinking of algorithms and autonomous and semi-autonomous weapons, and you're thinking, okay, this is war. This is international humanitarian law. But in order to run the digital economy, everything needs an algorithm. It needs something to tell it what to do and how to think. And it does so by building the fancy formula, yes. But then we humans are so bright, we taught people how to machine learn, deep learn. And what I think for me as a competition practitioner is the worst, reinforced learning. When you create this algorithm on a platform, it uses trial and error, and it puts more weight onto the result that has the most success. It does not need human intervention. It means that traditionally, people who can compete, assess a market, sit down in a conference room and say, okay, maybe we can do this, are disadvantaged by competition that's happening now in a flick, in a click, in an instant. So this is also part of the scope that we need to think about. So we can agree with Evangelista that there's a positive relationship on economic growth and the digital economy, because there's a lot of trade facilitation happening between distinct and interdependent groups, and value is created. However, at the start, we had Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and we all said, similar to all forms of technology in the information world, let's create and open it up for them. Innovate, innovate, innovate. The first time there was radio, we said, leave them alone, innovate. And then when piracy started to happen, that's when laws came in. So this is the same thing that's happening. It's going to be, from a policy point of view, when you allow the innovation, when you sandbox and you allow growth, and then when you realize, I need to intervene now, right? Now, if we can look at internet usage, we can see that the issues happening in the world outside are happening in the Caribbean, and it's just as important to us, the digital economy. Because this is some information from the ITU, and Sophie, you know, from in my former hat at TAT, I always had some issues with the data because, you know, it tends to be extrapolated. And the reason why it's extrapolated is because a lot of data has to go through central statistical offices. And these offices don't necessarily work at the same time of the regulators or the people who have the information. But just basically, we can see that we had an increase of about 5.3% in 2020. And, you know, we moved up to 59.1%. So, you know, things happened. The importance of me showing you this particular diagram, I don't know how well you are seeing it there. It's because I want you now to understand that all of these things are happening, and it means that we have to have some policy and we have to have some regulatory interventions in order to fix. And in the yellow are what we call the macro policy interventions. It's only 4, but there are others that Vashti has mentioned, the cybersecurity, the cyber health, all of these things. But competition is the first one that I want you to really note, because we want competitive market to nurture innovation and an enabling environment to reap digital dividends. Now, some of the things that the heads said in Suriname in 2022 July, nothing about competition or trade, but they said things about food security, climate change, agriculture, fuel security. Do you all think any of those things have anything to do with competition and trade? Just by a show of hands. Yes, put up your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9. AG, you're not putting up your hand. That's a bad thing, man. right? So yes, they do, because in order to reap the digital dividends, you have to have things working on the back end. Right? You know, what happens at the front end always has a back end. I know that doesn't sound right in carnival time, but really and truly, if we want to jump up in international trade, we have to understand both ends matter. All right, so here now is the part that I don't like, but I see Annie Baldeo in the crowd, who I worked with. She was my fellow executive at TAT. So if I need any help, I'm going to harass her. Now, I call it Competition 101 because it is just simply what I want you to know and what I need to know about how we assess competition issues. So, when we say competition law, we seem to not recall that it is just one little teeny tiny part of competition policy. Competition policy is not the policy that is used to draft a competition bill. Competition policy is all the aspects required to have a competitive market, whether it's national or regional. So you have to have certain things in there to help you, and competition legislation is only one of them. And the aim is that we want to make sure that there is no restriction or distortion of competition, because what we want is an open level playing field where firms can self-sustain their own rivalry, what we call contestability. You have to be able to contest your market. And we look at two things: consumer welfare and efficiency loss. And we build what's called a theory of harm. Now, there are some forces in TAT that don't like me to say theory of harm because they're a regulator, but from a competition perspective, you must build a theory of harm before you intervene. If you don't have harm, you have to leave it alone and let the market play. Now, when I say consumer, how many economists in the room? Oh, well, then this is really important because I've only seen a few hands, so good. Now, this little area here, I want you to notice when we say that we want an efficient market, it means that, you're hearing me in the back? Yeah, man, my mouth big. This is quantity, and that's the price. Optimum. Oh, the people on the line, lend me the mic. Okay, because I know I have a timeline, so I have to. We need to make sure that there's equilibrium. Equilibrium only happens when the two things meet at this point. So what should happen is that your producers get a surplus, so they're happy, but on top there, your consumer must get a surplus, so they are happy. And when there's a loss in the market, there is a loss of efficiency, it's because something is causing deadweight, a deadweight loss. And it means that my producer in my market has pushed things up so much above optimum price that it's taken away from my consumer surplus. And when I say consumer surplus, I don't just mean consumers, but I mean market as well. So we have, who taken this from me? The presumption is that markets will work well when you leave them alone. We don't want to intervene. But what becomes really important for us are two things: the nature of the market and the conduct of firms. Now, the nature of the market, when we say scale or scope of the economy, it means that the industry that you've entered into is large. So you will have a large market share because of what you do. You are going to have a lot of customers. You supply water to Barbados. You can't have 4 and 5 firms supplying water. You supply electricity. You can't have 4 or 5 in a small island. You could have it in America, Germany, but you have to know your market and you have to know certain things. Something called network effects will naturally come with the type of industry you've chosen. And that simply means that the more users you have, you become more attractive to other users, and you become to have more value. You will have switching costs, and by that we mean consumers are going to think really hard before they change because of the time and effort it's going to take to leave you and make a new account, right? So information big important issue, not just between consumer and business, but also between business and business. Are they sharing enough for you to have access to compete? Are they giving you time on their infrastructure? Conduct of firms via collusion, tacit or explicit. What do I mean by collusion? While I drink water. Anybody? One instance where you think you have experienced any market collusion. There's a really big one we've all experienced. Not telecoms. Telecoms too recent. No, but we've all experienced it. Air tickets. Airlines. Have you ever gone on British Airways and Virgin American Airlines and realized it's all the same price? Even KLM. So this is something big that's happening. Restrictive and prohibitive agreements, consumer contractual clauses which basically lock you in. These are certain things that will naturally happen in certain industries. And other than the natural causes, what we have to look at in competition law is whether there's market power, meaning that you can affect the market. We also look at durability, because sometimes you can affect the market and it's temporary, you get a temporary gain. But is your market power sustainable, independent to anything else? So you become so powerful that you have become self-regulatory. And you can abuse this dominance. You can enter into restrictive or prohibitive agreements, and you can conduct mergers and acquisitions. And if your behavior or conduct lessens or impedes effective competition, then it is a competition concern. It is not a concern if you are dominant and if you have market power, if you are causing benefit to your market and to your consumers. The problem is when you start to affect us as a whole. Now, some sectors lend themselves naturally to the creation of monopolies, like utilities, because of the sheer cost of the investment required. We, as competition lawyers, will only intervene when you have exploitation of customers and trading counterparties in business-to-business commerce. And how we do it is we may try to compel access, we try to remove bottlenecks, and we try to minimize refusal of supply. When you have a few people acting together, it's called an oligopoly. And that is happening recently in airlines, in ICT, that kind of thing. But it's important to us because all of these things are very, very pertinent to platforms. Now, I'm going to just highlight to you some of these here, where you have competitive exclusion by dominant firms, and you have something called killer acquisitions. These two are very important in our discussion. Why? I want you to just think back to the early days of Microsoft, and they just ate everything up around them. And the reason was because they wanted to prevent them from actually becoming a competitor in the future. It wasn't because they had any kindness in their heart. So what happened is that they took innovative technology, cut off that innovation, and retained it into their own operating systems and Android systems. Now, what are the concerns that we've just noted of competition generally? A digital platform naturally, without any action, is going to be seen as anti-competitive because of its natural tendencies. Not that it is anti-competitive or behaving anti-competitively, but it is a multi-sided market with a platform structure that has many sides to it. So therefore you have to assess each side. It's not just one side you have to assess. You have very strong network effects. The more people on Amazon and Facebook and Google, the bigger and better they get. And it leads to something that we call tipping, which means that because of the network effects, you're naturally going to tip towards being a monopoly, whether you want to or not. And from the competition perspective, this is only an issue if you have single homing, meaning that the person only wants to go to Amazon. But if the base is happy to multi-home, I can go to Amazon, I could go to Google Shopping, I could go to Etsy, I can go to eBay, multi-homing is fine. It shows that you still have choice. So, gatekeeping is another major problem that's occurred, and the EU market has actually built in Digital Markets Act, which is going to kick in 2024. They're doing some assessments this year, where you actually become the gatekeeper to all data and information upstream and downstream. Algorithms, which I also mentioned, can tacitly assist collusion because of the pricing mechanisms. So you can actually be very anti-competitive depending on the algorithm you have put in place, and nobody will know. He just told me I had 10 minutes, so you all are going to have to read plenty. Now, the thing is that we have some key consumer concerns. With the exploitative practices, digital platforms tend to take advantage of human biases. So that means that you automatically are going to be held. With data privacy and security and ownership, it's very easy for you to just give your information to the Google, the TikTok, and the Facebook, and you're signing agreements that you don't know what your redress is. And the algorithmic biases and use of artificial intelligence, it means that you have sale of data, you have cartel-type pricing, and you can also have disadvantage to minority groups with facial recognition. So for example, I own an Airbnb website, and with facial recognition, I can actually edit who I prefer to stay in my home. Even if it could be a natural Native American Indian, the face recognized, and I say, well, no, I don't want them in my Swiss chalet. So you understand the concerns for some of the high-tech digitalization. Now, I just want to mention Google Shopping, because Google Shopping had self-preferencing, which means that they're promoting themselves via advertising and pushing themselves up. They were also, with the Google search, they were also protecting their dominant position in the market by concluding exclusive agreements with third parties. And this has happened not just in the EU, but the US has also taken note of the activities in the digital platform. And I can just tell you, in July 2022, there was an investigation into digital markets. Some of the CEOs, the 5 key CEOs, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, and they were a little non-compliant with giving information to their House, to their Congress. But the committee indicated that they now serve as gatekeepers, and they control access to markets, and they can pick winners and losers. And they are controlling the infrastructure of the digital age, and they have abused their role as intermediaries. This is pretty important when you look at it from the CSME perspective, because if you look at this chart, I don't know how you're going to see it, but if you realize that the details of it, it shows that these same players are regularly used in CARICOM. And it shows that Google owns Chrome browser, Apple owns Safari. Google Search, however, is the default search engine on both internet browsers, and it means that there's a situation of dominance in the Caribbean. However, in the Caribbean, we don't have legislation, and we have 2 key things that we need to analyze. Cost of general online search. Are they deterring other search engines? So it's already happening here, but because of our legislative gaps, we can't move forward. Now, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas in Chapter 8 created CCC, and our aim is to ensure object or effect of business conduct is prevented so that it does not prevent, restrict, or distort competition. And Mr. AG, there's a 3-tier situation where we have the community responsibility, but we have national competition enforcements that are required to work with the Competition Commission, similar to, I would say, ECTEL for telecommunications. And if that isn't in place, it means that we can't work. So we do have a draft CARICOM model bill that provides for all 3 pillars: restrictive agreements, abuse of dominance, and merger review. We only have 4 countries, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana, with legislation, right? When you get the presentation, I'll ask you to look at the substantive legal tests, and most of them are the same, which is whether you are likely to have or you have affected, prevented, restricted, or distorted competition. There's no way you're going to see this, but there is sector-specific legislation in some of the countries that may address some of the competition issues. Now, when you're adapting the current situation, you have to look at how we define markets. And usually, when you define a market, it's going to be very specific. With digital economy, you can't be specific. So if you want to define a substitute for a product, you have to go to if it can compete for consumer time, attention, and data, and not just if it is a perfect substitute. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you can't just say people are merging and it's wrong. You have to look at the efficiencies, and you have to look at all sides of the platform, not just one. Yep, I have 5 more minutes. So, no man, I have 5. So what we want to, I will just quickly tell you, there's a lack of national competition legislation in 9 states. There's a lack of privacy and data legislation that is equipped for the digital economy. There's a lack of clear search and seizure investigative powers for both national and regional competition authorities. And there is need to ensure that both your structural and behavioral remedies are allocated efficiently. Some things are going to rest better with your consumer and sector-specific regulators. Some will rest with your competition authorities. Do not adopt EU and US models carte blanche. The EU has direct applicability. They have a huge market. We do not. It must be tailored. Some people tell me that they've gone to so-and-so country and pulled down legislation. I beg you, please don't do that. I'm going to skate through these. You're going to have to look at it. With the consumer welfare remedies, we do have to review our legislation because we are not taking into account the effects of our consumers via online mechanisms. We do have to check jurisdictional overlaps because if all the sector regulators have the same thing, your consumer authorities need to be very clear on who does what. And obviously, this area cannot be covered in one session. What we do under the treaty as CCC is that we sensitize everybody in the CSME. Please reach out to me. We not only just answer questions right now, but reach out to competition@ccc.sr or get my information here for us to do in-country interventions where we can explain the necessity of competition and consumer protection law, explain how it aids competitiveness, and how it is needed for all aspects of your business, particularly the digital economy. Thank you very much, and I've put some extra reading there. Very interesting is the State of Competition report we just published. I've put the link there so that you can get all the details I had in this presentation on the state and readiness of the consumer and the competition legislation. Thank you very much.
Don't move. We'd just like to, Navia, thank you very much for very
so much to tell them,
engaging discussion. And the good thing is that you all will have the opportunity to continue telling Navia or have Navia tell you things during the cocktails where you will discuss competitions to your heart delight. Before we move on to other speaker, mindful of the time, I'd just like to know if we have any questions to Navia, because I know
which can be taken at another time if they wish.
If there are no questions, we can move on to the next presenter.
Hi, thanks. I don't mean to prolong the session, but specifically because we're actually dealing with the situation now with telcos. We talk about the big. You mentioned a few of the big tech companies and so on, and how they operate within the market. But realistically, with these big tech global companies, how realistic it is for us to have oversight or to enforce legislation with respect to unfair competition when in many cases they're doing business in the market, but they're not registered here, of course. I mean, very popular services that we all use like WhatsApp that are competing with operators, for example. and Netflix and others that don't have a broadcast license, but they offer their services. How realistic it is for us to apply legislation in context of these big tech companies? Thanks.
So that's a good question, and it is one that plagues us because of our small size. But the thing is, first of all, you could go the very, very extreme route on the spectrum, which is block them from entering your system through your ISPs unless they have contractual agreements to do so. There are pros of tax revenues, income to your ISPs, etc. But it would also lead to them assessing, is this burden worth it? But the second one, which can prove a little bit more influential, is having discussions, not multilateral, but business discussions with the regulators and with the countries, so that you have a different level of understanding on what can happen, and with a little bit of peer pressure. So negotiations tend to be very helpful. So don't go the way of China and just block, but you can actually have negotiations, business negotiations, and they can work for certain standards. And I know Vashti has standards coming up on cybersecurity and so on. But from a standardization perspective and a harmonization perspective, that helps. Also, use the CARICOM network. First of all, if you start to build, as CTU, as CCC, and as TCS, you start to build what are the key things that we need happening in the region, and what are the key things we need to prioritize as protections. And we build that as the status point for negotiation, and then we start. That is how you work, because you can't do legislation at such a finite level that you don't want to attract the business in. But that is something that we started to look at in 2019. I've put the link on there with all the presentations on competition in the digital era, and it is something that we are going to work on in the future, hopefully with CTU. Right?
Feel free to ask Nivea all the questions during the cocktails. I'm sure she'd love that. So on this note, I am aware we have a coffee break right now, but I'm going to kindly ask if we could just take 5 minutes, stretch your legs, get your cup of coffee, you come back in, because we have a very, very engaging presentation on telecommunications next up by Anibal Dev. So on that note, we can just take a 5-minute break to get some coffee. Thank you. Which is outside. Ms. Annie Baldeo from the Telecommunications Authority. Ms. Baldeo is the Executive Officer, Policy, Planning and Economics at the Telecommunications Authority. And she has served with TAT for over 17 years. In fact, I remember Annie from even when I joined the government, Annie was at TAT. And here she is with her wealth of experience on telecommunications and building the digital economy. I'm going to hand over to Annie, and while she puts up her presentation, we're going to get everyone else to come in so we can start with her work. So thank you, Annie. Let me just watch this.
So good afternoon, everyone. Last lap, promise. One of the very last presentations for today. So as Nivya said, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist. So today, what we'll be seeing, some statistics, some data, and some statistics that we have for you. Today, I wanted to share our experience in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly as TAT, and some of the fundamental steps that we are taking to help bridge the digital divide in Trinidad and Tobago. There we go. So on the agenda, I just want to summarize a bit on what we do at TAT, the Telecoms Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, the concept of universal service, and explain what that term means. And then I want to zero in on the digital divide and some of the initiatives that we are implementing at TAT to help bridge the digital divide. So in terms of TAT, who are we and what do we do? We are the Telecoms Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and we are responsible for regulating both the telecoms and the broadcasting sector. And we are governed by our Telecoms Act, and the objects of our act are on screen: creating an open telecoms market with conditions for fair competition, ensuring the orderly development of telecoms, protecting and promoting the public interest, facilitating universal access to telecommunications, encouraging investors to come into our industry, and regulating the broadcasting sector. So on the fourth point in the previous slide, we looked at facilitating access to telecommunications. And this leads me to universal access. Within our Telecoms Act, Section 28 of our Telecoms Act talks about universal service. And from the Act, we developed our universal service framework and our universal service regulations. And the concept of universal service, it means having all of our citizens, everybody in the country, having access to basic telecom services. And when we talk about basic telecom services, we are looking at access to fixed and mobile voice services, access to the internet, access to directory inquiries, access to emergency services, and so on. So that's why we have universal service as being one of the very important objects of our Act. And there are three fundamental principles that comes under universal service, and that is ICT availability. That is, the service should be available to all inhabited parts of the country. We have ICT accessibility. All citizens can use the service regardless of location, regardless of gender, disabilities, and so on. And ICT affordability. Everybody, all citizens should be able to afford basic telecom services. And in order for us to meet our universal service obligations, we first need to measure and identify where the digital divide exists in our country. Because, as this slide says, it's a very famous quotation, what is not measured quickly becomes invisible, and what is invisible is lost, and what is lost cannot be acted on or remedied. So we have defined digital divide, we have defined it in our universal service framework as the gap that exists between those who have access to ICTs and those that do not. And this gap can exist in different forms. It can exist amongst your population groups. So for example, persons with disabilities, different age groups, persons of different economic status. It can exist amongst geographical areas, different areas within your country may not have access to ICTs, and the digital divide can also exist within regions and within countries, because different countries are different aspects of progress differently when it comes to ICTs. And this is what I want, a key thing I wanted to touch on, and we have Sophie here from the ITU. Over the years, we have been measuring the digital divide, and we use this tool that is the ICT Development Index. This is a tool that has been developed by the ITU, and it is internationally recognized because at the end of the day, whichever tool we use to measure the digital divide, we need to ensure that it meets international standards and is comparable on an international basis. So this is a tool that we currently use, the IDI, and the IDI comprises of 11 main indicators, and they're divided into 3 different subgroups. The first subgroup being the access subindex, and there are 5 indicators under there. There is a usage subindex with 3 indicators, and the skill subindex with 3 additional indicators. So to measure the digital divide in Trinidad and Tobago, over the last couple of years, we started in 2021, we did a digital inclusion survey, and that survey lasted just about a year. And I just wanted to touch on the methodology that we used for the survey. It was a multi-stage survey, and we interviewed just about 6,000 households throughout Trinidad and Tobago. That's about 17,000 individuals who were interviewed, and that's of our population is around 1.3 million people. And the base document, the survey instrument that we used was a questionnaire that the ITU uses in order to collect ICT statistics. So that is what we used as our base question, and we built questions on top of that. And then we use the IDI at the end of the day to measure where we were in terms of a digital divide. And these are some of the results coming out of the digital inclusion survey. So the IDI ranges from 0 to 10. 10 meaning that there is no digital divide existing in your country. And this is where we were as at 2022. Trinidad and Tobago, we measured just about 7.86 on the IDI. And you would see on screen as well the different municipalities and communities within Trinidad and Tobago. So those to the right of the screen, on that side, those are communities that we consider underserved because they fall under the national IDI level. There we go. So in terms of the 3 different sub-indices that we just looked at, now this was not the first digital inclusion survey that we did. The first one we did was in 2007, and the second one we did was in 2013. So what we did was we measured how we have progressed in terms of the 3 different indicators, the 3 different sub-indices. And what we saw in terms of the access sub-index, we increased by 11%, which is okay. In the usage sub-index, we increased by about 13%, and in skill sub-index, this was incredible, we increased by about 78%. And I'll explain what that means in a couple of slides later down. This is some further statistics that came out of the survey. What it showed is that under infrastructure and access, in terms of mobile coverage, 100% of the country is covered by 3G. Just about 75%, it's probably a bit more now, probably closer to 80%, is covered by 4G, and this is according to the data that we would have collected from our service providers. In terms of phone ownership, just about 84% of the population owns a mobile phone. And these are some very interesting statistics now. Out of that 84%, 85% are female and 83% are male. And that's good news for us because it means in terms of gender equality, men and women seem to be on almost the same level in ICTs. Some other statistics coming out of the survey. What the data showed is that 81% of households in Trinidad and Tobago had access to the internet. What it also showed is that 60% of households have access to a computer now. We found this figure quite low. 60% have access to a computer, and what we realized, I had mentioned that we had used the IQ-based questionnaire for the survey. The term computer that's defined under the indicators, it does not include smartphones and mobile phones and so on. So this 60% does not include those devices, just strictly computers like this, the laptop, and that's why that figure looks a bit low. But as you all know, some persons, a smartphone actually is a substitute for a computer in most cases. You know, you go online with it, you can do classes online with it. So we think this figure is a bit higher than it actually is. In terms of households with internet access at home, so we saw that 81% of households actually had access, but 79% of those households were in rural areas and 83% were in urban areas in Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of mobile and fixed telephone subscriptions, so our mobile subscription is just about 145, meaning most persons have more than one phone. In terms of fixed telephony, 71% of households in Trinidad and Tobago actually have a fixed telephone subscription, which we found was very high because mobile phones have now become a substitute for fixed lines, and we find persons are giving up their fixed lines, but it's at 71% as at the end of last year. In terms of active mobile broadband subscriptions, 58 out of every 100 inhabitants had an active mobile broadband subscription, so mostly a postpaid phone. For fixed broadband subscriptions, 90 out of every 100 persons actually had a fixed broadband subscription. And if we delve a little deeper into the fixed broadband subscription, so that amounts to around 377,600 persons subscribing to fixed broadband services. The majority of those subscriptions were greater than 10 meg. Actually, when we, from the data we collected from the service providers last year, more than 80% of the subscriptions were over 100 megs per second. So this data is a bit outdated, but 100 megs for small islands, I think that's fantastic in terms of statistics. In terms of individuals using the internet, 79% of the population actually uses the internet. And again, some good statistics for us. 82% of that 79% were females, 76% were males. And what we also found is that the majority of users were within the category of 15 to 24 years old. Prices, what we saw when it came to prices. Our mobile and internet packages account for just about 2% of consumers' GNI per capita, and that is, I believe, within the acceptable standards for the ITU as being considered affordable basic telecom services. For skills, what we saw is that 73% of individuals had basic telecom skills, but just 4% of individuals had advanced telecom skills. And when we talk about advanced telecom skills, we're talking about being able to do programming and that type of IT work. So how can we use the results that came out of this survey to help bridge the digital divide? What we have done, we have used this data and we have come up with universal service projects, universal service initiatives. And one of the main initiatives that we have, it's called a TT Wi-Fi project. This is a government initiative to allow the general public to access free quality broadband internet to be productive while they wait at public locations. So we have rolled out Wi-Fi services to all public libraries within Trinidad and Tobago, to all schools without connectivity, so that's all primary and secondary level schools, the different transportation hubs around the country, and the public waiting areas and health institutions, so hospitals and health centers and so on also have access to the TT Wi-Fi service. One of the other initiatives we have rolled out for universal service is the Persons with Disabilities Initiative. And this seeks to promote digital inclusion for persons with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago. It was launched just about 3 years ago. And the goal is to provide subsidized mobile handsets containing assistive technologies to persons who are visually and or hearing impaired or have a disability and is in receipt of a disability use grant from our Ministry of Social Development. We are hoping to expand this project a bit and roll it out not only just to those who are visually and hearing impaired, but to all persons who have a disability. In terms of infrastructure projects, we are rolling out ICT access centers throughout the country. The latest ones are going to be in Tobago. That's where we are focusing on this year. And we are also rolling out infrastructure projects to areas that are considered underserved. So we actually have contractual obligations with our service providers to roll out infrastructure in areas like Barbados and so on in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Mr. Khan, that's, I'm sure I'm within time. That's the end of my That's the end of my presentation. Please visit our website. The Digital Inclusion Report is published on our website. Some of the data that I showed within the presentation is contained within our market reports. We publish annual and quarterly market reports with data that we collect from the service providers. So that brings me to the end. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I just wanted quickly to mention, Annie, for those who don't know that TAT there's not a goodie bag, but they collect revenues from concessionaires and licensees of ICT sector, and coming out of those fees, they apportion a little bit to the Universal Service Fund. So I just wanted to just beef up that little point for them so that you know where the $600 coming from and the Wi-Fi rollout of the buildings. Yeah, good.
Yeah, so actually it's about 1% of the revenues that the service providers make for the year that is contributed towards universal service. Right now it's just for the telecom operators. Soon we are hoping to have our act amended so that fees can be collected from our broadcasters as well. So we can actually start rolling out broadcast universal service initiatives in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Navia.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I see that I have a question submitted from our online participants. It's from Monique Clements. I think we all know Monique. She's from the Ministry of Digital Transformation, I believe, in Trinidad. Beyond the restricted definition of computer, what are the limitations and or variation in the indicators should be taken into consideration from the last period just before this survey for more accurate analysis when using these findings?
That's a very good question. At the ITU, they are currently revising some of the definitions that are contained within the indicators handbook. They're actually revising the IDI indicator, the IDI index as well. In terms of computer, we found the definition just a bit restrictive, especially with what happened with the pandemic. A lot of persons, they didn't have access to laptops, but persons had access to a mobile phone. They had access to tablets and so on that acted just as good as a computer to get online, to do classes, to access banking services online and so on. So in revising the ITU definition of computer, that's one of the things we want to consider, expanding the definition to not only include computers, but not only laptops, but tablets and smartphones and smart devices and so on.
Vashti? Sorry, just one question as well. Thank you. Rodney Taylor. The ITU has an initiative by 2030 to connect the unconnected globally. Is there any such targets with Trinidad and Tobago to connect those unconnected communities and individuals, number one? And number two, what flexibility do you have on the USF? So besides bringing the connectivity to the home or to the community, specifically on other things that would provide meaningful connectivity. So even the devices, for example, and also the digital skills, basic knowledge and how to use the technology tools. Is that within the scope of the USF?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Currently, it isn't. But what we realized is that when the regulations were drafted, there were things that it was at that point in time. Things happened. The pandemic happened. While the regulations didn't allow us. I'll give an example. We purchased 10,000 tablets to give out to schools around the country because there were students who were underprivileged and did not have access any way to get online to do online classes. So we purchased 10,000 tablets, and it was through the Universal Service Fund. And while the regulations, it's not clear in the regulations that we can use the regulations to do that. We saw it as an initiative. At the end of the day, we said the definition of universal services, every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago should have access to basic telecom services. And we believe these tablets were an instrument to help persons reach that objective. So we did that initiative, and Nivea mentioned it was the Universal Service Fund, which funded it through the USF. And we actually asked our service providers, Digital and B-Mobile, to purchase the tablets for us. So the monies went back to those service providers and purchasing the tablets, and then we gave it to the Ministry of Education. Ashley, just remind me of the first question again. Right. So within the Ministry of Digital Transformation, we do have the National ICT Plan, and I think it's currently being redrafted. And I do believe there are specific targets within that plan. From those targets, we also do a strategic plan for that, and we will be including some of those targets so that we can help connect the unconnected and meet the obligations of the UN.
I see there's another question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Annie, for a very comprehensive presentation there. I noticed the penetration for the computers in the homes, which is around 60%, I think.
Yeah.
Which we did a similar survey in St. Vincent and the Grenadines about 2 years ago, and we had similar numbers. And I was trying to find like the root cause of it, which I think maybe goes back to maybe affordability, which you look at more like laptops, computers, which are more expensive than a smartphone, and which we believe is needed, especially for certain things, doing schoolwork, university learning. It's a lot better to do it on a computer than a smartphone, right? I also saw where you use the criteria from the ITU to do the survey, and the way you reference the affordability within the GNI percentage, you think you're within that. But I was wondering, I don't think I ever saw a criteria for device affordability. We see it for broadband, I think, like the cost of broadband, and they give you the GNI, it should be within to get it. But I don't think there's one for devices, if you follow me. Because years ago, if you had a fixed line, you had a fixed line with a telephone together, you had a whole package. Yes. But when you get the internet now, broadband, you can't work unless you get a computer. But we seem to spend a lot of attention to the actual cost of the broadband, but not the device to go with the broadband. Yeah. So I don't know if there actually is an index to measure that affordability, especially for developing countries like in the Caribbean. We did some work recently. If you compare it, I made up one for myself, and a kind of affordability index, and look at the numbers like in the USA, and there's a big difference. Yeah. As compared to the devices in the Caribbean. Yeah. So I don't know if there's actually one ITU use or if something we should look at to help us when we're doing this whole trying to bridge the digital divide.
Apollo, that's a very good question. Within the IDI, it doesn't look at the affordability of devices like computers. And you're right, the cost of it is much higher than a smartphone and so on, and that's possibly why the figures were reading so low in our countries. If you have a look at our digital inclusion report, within a report, aside from measuring the IDI, we also came up with another index. We call it the Digital Inclusion Index. It's an index we created on our own. We looked at the different indices that the UN had to come up with a more inclusive type index. I want to put it like that because it measures affordability to a greater extent. Within that index, please have a look at our digital inclusion report and see how it is we came up with those indicators within the report. And in terms, so not just in terms of affording the services themselves, but affording the devices, your laptops, your cell phones, and so on. Currently, our universal service regulation speaks to telecom services. So it hasn't been expanded yet to accommodate devices. And that's one of the things we're looking at in terms of amending our regulations to have it accommodate both services as well as devices that can support those services.
Okay, we have one final. You all want to collaborate and split your question in half? Okay, we'll just take these two final questions because we want to keep on time. And we do have a very dynamic presentation to top of the day on cyber scandals and espionage, and we don't want to miss out on that. So you can go ahead first, and then the gentleman in back.
Thank you. I'm Simone Joseph Oliver from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My question refers to the results or the stats you got from the survey with ICT skills. I noticed for the basic skills, you have a decent number, 73%, yeah. But for the standard and the advanced skills, they're a bit low. So now that you have the data, is there any plan in place to find solutions or things that can be done in order to improve the skills of the citizens? And one of the reasons why I'm asking is because for us, we are currently going through the digital transformation process, and we are actually working on that gap, that market assessment we just did recently in terms of finding out where the gaps are with our skills. So I want to know if there is something that you would have done or plan to do that we can learn from that and apply it to us in St. Vincent.
Very good question as well. So 4%, that's where we were in terms of persons, the population having advanced ICT skills, and that was a red flag for us. So what we have done, again, in the digital inclusion report, we have identified projects that we can work on to help raise that figure. One of the projects will be with our line ministry, the Ministry of Digital Transformation, to help roll out programs to persons within the country. And one of the ways we can do it, I had mentioned we are doing some infrastructure type projects. For example, our ICT access centers, we can actually use those centers to host workshops to educate persons and help raise that level of skills within Trinidad and Tobago. So that's just one of the means we are using to try and help increase our advanced skills index.
All right, and we have one final question for you, Annie.
Actually, it was the similar question, very similar. So we did actually split it. I'm Rodney Payne. I'm the project manager for the Public Sector Modernization Program, and it was about improving the digital skills of the populace, as well as I just want to understand more about the infrastructures, how that was being rolled out, and what were the real objectives of it, and how it was being funded.
Right. So the infrastructure type projects are being funded through our USF as well. Our universal service regulations talk about two types of projects: mandatory universal service initiatives and what we call contractual universal service initiatives. And that's where our infrastructure projects fall under the contractual obligations. So what we do, we draft an RFP with what infrastructure we are looking at rolling out, and we allow the service providers to bid for those infrastructure projects. So we use what we call a reverse auction process, and whoever comes in with the lowest bid but meets all of the criteria we have within the RFP, we then allocate them the project. So that's one of the ways we are rolling out the infrastructure projects. In terms of the skills as well, I forgot to mention, what we tend to do, every year we celebrate Girls in ICTs Day and World Telecom's Information Day. and we try to help improve the skills within the country. So last year, what we did, we partnered with our national libraries, we partnered with NALIS, and we launched a series of programs online where we taught persons how to do different skills on your phone, how to use your phone to do this, how to access apps on your phone, how to download apps and those type of things. So we actually create programs to help build basic skills, and a lot of the elderly within our population, they were able to access these videos and they benefited a lot from it. Yeah. Did I answer your question on the infrastructure though, or was there another part of it? Yeah. We do have published on our website as well our universal service initiatives, and there's a section that talks about our infrastructure projects. There's a lot of detail within that report that talks about how we actually roll out the infrastructure projects in the country. And it's on our website at tat.org.tt.
Vashti, if you permit me 1 second, just to really re-emphasize a quick point, and that is that I think this avenue of the USF is underestimated by many countries in the Caribbean. Many countries have resource limitation and challenges, and unfortunately do not have a universal service fund, obligation, legislation, etc., to support some of the new things we are talking about. I think the model that we hear from Trinidad here is a perfect example that if we talk about one Caribbean, and CARICOM would be useful because governments are asking for help financially. And this we hear for rural community connectivity, transport, public service, etc. Annie, I don't know if you have a dollar figure that you can probably share for what your funds would have been in utilizing for which the country benefit or users benefit over the probably last 3 years. I see your friends saying no, but I think it's plenty money. Yes, you want to probably share how much millions it had been. Over to you. Sorry for that, Vashti, but I think it's important.
Actually, I think before Annie answers that, your colleague Sophie would also like to add to what you're saying, if that's okay.
Yes, to supplement Cleveland's point, and Annie will have a flashback to 10 years ago when we were doing the universal service regulations within the HIPCAR project. And she will remember that I feel very strongly, I agree with Cleveland, Universal Service Fund is an important tool and mechanism, but don't stare yourself blind on the Universal Service Fund, because what Annie put forward was you need to look at it holistically. So you really need to look at the universal service financing within a context. And that context is measure the gap. Do the homework, measure the gap, and then have the tools that can include pay or play, that can include other financing mechanisms. I would like to put out there that we've just released our universal service financing toolkit, and we also have capacity building and training that's just become available. But the fund is important, but as I said, don't stare yourself blind just on the fund. Look at the financing, look at partners that can help you finance that gap. Because when we're talking about digital, when we're talking about bringing into connectivity into other sectors, into other public areas, it's about collaboration with the other sectors as well. So look at it as universal service financing within a holistic strategy, and part of that is the fund, but it's not just the fund. I just wanted to add that. Sorry, Cleveland.
Sophie, that's a very good point. And just banking on what Cleveland just said, Cleveland, I can't recall offhand just how much we spent on our universal service projects thus far, but we do have a report published on our website. It's the accounting report that we publish for the Universal Service Fund, and the monies that we spend, how much we collect, and how much we spend. It's contained within that report because we want to be as transparent as possible. Those service providers that contribute towards the fund, we want them to see where the monies are going. And just to add as well, so while we do collect just around 1% of the revenues from our telecom service providers to go into the fund, a lot of the funding also comes from us, from TAT. because we do collect concessional license fees from our service providers. A portion of it goes towards our operating costs, and a portion of it, whatever excess there is surplus, goes towards our consolidated fund for the government. And we take a percentage, a portion of that fund, and of the consolidated fund, the amounts that's allocated to the consolidated fund, and put it into our USF. And that is what funds a lot of our universal service projects. So it's not just contributions from our service providers, but from us financing the fund as well.
Thank you very much, Annie. Annie, I think we need to give you an award. Mohammed did not wave his paper at you.
Yeah, but I thought there was a lesson.
Yeah.
Finish before your time, otherwise you face a small person.
And I think it was absolutely engaging. So no pressure at all, Anselm. Who is our next presenter? Could you put up his bio? So Anselm Charles is the current Information and Communications Technology Manager with oversight of ICT projects, services, and infrastructure at CARICOM Impacts. Anselm joined the agency many, many moons ago, and since that time has spearheaded many integral regional projects involving APIS, cargo information, passenger information, as well as activities that fall under the CARICOM Cybersecurity and Cybercrime Action Plan. In his free time, Anselm enjoys creating beautiful presentations that will capture your imagination and make sure you don't fall asleep at the end of a very long day. I now hand over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. That's just the right side of the table. So good afternoon to the left side of the table. Because I believe, we need to be inclusive. But I heard Vashti after lunch saying that she had the most difficult time slot. And I believe I have one up to you, because I am the only thing standing, well, beside the wrap-up, standing between you and Barbados. For those of us who enjoy what Barbados has to offer, I will just leave it there, not to protect the innocent. So as the presentation goes up, as was said, my name is Anselm Charles. I am the ICT manager at CARICOM Impacts. And usually when I'm doing this presentation, it is along the lines of cyber and what's going on in the region and all the infiltrations and etc. And when I was asked to do this, I was told we need to focus on the legal frameworks, because how do we build, the Computer Misuse Acts and those cybercrime acts, how do we use those things and why are they important as we move towards expanding the digital economy within the region? Still waiting for the presentation. I'm told I can't finish. Does this count against my time? I'm curious.
I need to stop.
But I mean, I could begin without my presentation. It makes, so just to start it off, for those of you who may or may not know, CARICOM Impacts actually stands for, and we have a thing in the region for long names, so bear with me, the Caribbean Community Implementation Agency for Crime and Security. This is why we just call it CARICOM Impacts, or for short, Impacts. It was established in 2006 out of a heads of government meeting, which coincidentally there's one this week in the Bahamas. And our mandate is basically the crime and security agenda within the region. So we focus on intelligence, support to our member states. We have 15 member states and 5 associate states. So we support them in intelligence operations, border security operations, and of 2017, cybersecurity and cybercrime was added to that list. We are a triad agency, meaning that we have a head office or HQ. It's based in Trinidad and Tobago. And then we have two sub-agencies, one specifically for intelligence, which is the Regional Intelligence Fusion Center, and the other one being the one here in Barbados, which is a Joint Regional Communication Center. The one in Trinidad and Tobago, RIFC, is responsible for intelligence, and the one in Barbados here, we do border services out of it. And here is my presentation. So we skipped that, we talked about that. Let's talk about the digital economy. One of the presenters earlier stated that there wasn't a specific definition for digital economy, which is true, just like cyber. There is no specific definition, but I've condensed it down for the purposes of this presentation to refer to the use of information technology to create or adapt, market or consume goods and services. Simplistic, one sentence. I think that covers what the digital economy is. And there are some benefits to a digital economy. You have infrastructure, you have e-business, you have e-commerce. But there is one thing that if you don't have, none of this will work. And anybody could tell me what that is. One key entity. What that is. Don't make me call names. I know a lot of you in the room. I know a lot of you without the name tags in the room. So one thing, anybody want to take a shot at it? What's that, sorry? Telecom. People. Who said it? People. Right? Somebody said it. So people. If we don't have people, then we can have all the legislation we to cover. We can have all the infrastructure. We can have, these wonderful platforms and, trade and all these things. But if we don't have people, then it's all for naught. But more importantly, we have the people, but the people have to trust the platform. They have to trust it. And as a ICT professional, and I'm sure some of you share the same sentiments, people are always very skeptical because, quite frankly, Netflix is a thing and they portray us in very bad light. I've never seen a movie where the ICT person isn't doing something nefarious. Right? It started off Jurassic Park. They had this big park with dinosaurs and one IT person, and then it went downhill from there. Right? So, and it reflects globally. Right? So we're going to focus on the light green line. And this is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And they did a survey and they asked a simple question, do you have trust in the ICT sector? Right? They did it both globally and in the US. And it started off at 77%, right? And it ended up at 68%. That's globally. But even worse is where the US populace started, and 78%, and it's all the way below 58%, which tells you this graph should be the other way around, because with COVID and the move to this whole digital, we should be trusting the system more. But why aren't we trusting the system? Why do we inherently think that the system is out to get us, right? And it's very simple, right? I like to break things down very simply. We just need three things, right? One, legislation is what we're going to cover today. So we're going to into a little more detail in that. You have two, you have accountability, which comes with legislation, but it basically tells the people, listen, if it goes wrong, and it usually will at some point, nobody is perfect, who do we hold accountable? What redress do we have? Right? And of course, you build that into legislation. And then you have sensitization. You educate the people, right? And when educating, you have to understand that not everyone is at the same level. So you then need to craft your education campaigns or your sensitization campaigns to ensure that you reach each and every demographic, because you can't just say that these digital services and this, by extension, this entire economy is only for a specific age group, 18 to 24, just pulling something out of my head. Because you would have those that are younger than that age group, and you have those that are older than in that age group, and you want to be able to reach those individuals. So, as I said before this presentation, we're more focusing on legislation, because without legislation, we can't really build that trust, because we can't regulate, we can't do anything without the legislation. It's just a free-for-all. So the simplistic question is, why legislation? And why do we need legislation? And I'm focusing here on cybercrime, because cybercrime legislation is, and I just want to make it known that this is not necessarily one particular piece of legislation. This could be a number of pieces of legislation that allows you to detect and prosecute cybercrime, which is usually the crime that comes out of any digital sphere or environment. So we have, of course, the borderless nature of cybercrime. As was mentioned many times today, and I'll just re-emphasize, most of the products and services within the region do not exist in one geographic location. So we need some sort of legislation to be able to police that borderless space, which is at some points the wild, wild west, to ensure that we create the notion that, listen, this is a secure space to our people. Remember, we're dealing with people, right? We have, of course, anonymity. You don't know who's on the other side of your computer screen. It may be no one. It may be an algorithm. It may be another computer. You don't know. So you need to ensure that that's also incorporated. Again, key area, you need to build trust. People are more going to be engaging with something digital if they know that there are safeguards behind it. And we want to increase participation, because when we increase participation, we then expand. And the only way to do that is the people need to trust us. And the only way to build that trust is to ensure and tell the people, listen, there is this new thing that we're pushing, these digital services, but these are the restrictions, these are the safeguards. And if it does go wrong, this is what is going to happen. We're going to prosecute, we're going to investigate, we're going to compensate. This is where your compensation is going to come from. This is what your compensation is going to be, and so forth and so forth. The last one here, and the second to last one, and to enhance cyber resilience and enhance DIP. DIP is simply detection, investigation, and prosecution. Because we tend to forget that piece of the legislation, because we also need to give our national enforcement, whatever that enforcement looks like, the tools and teeth needed to help detect, investigate, and prosecute. So what does legislation or good legislation look like? And I will make the notion now that, one, I am not a lawyer, right? And two, this may not be specific to everyone's application. This is general. Because with cyber is specific to an operating area. So while we do push for some sort of model legislation, there are times where where that harmonized legislation may have to be tweaked to specific situations that may be happening within a specific country. So the first thing we want to look at is what I have labeled as the 3 C's. Anybody want to take a stab at what the 3 C's are? Three C's. First C. What's the first C? No. Close though. Not as close. So the first C, the 3 C's deals with computers. So it's the 3 C's are basically where the computer is an accessory to a crime, where the computer is used as a weapon, and where the computer is a proxy to attack something else that's connected to that computer. Those are the 3 C's, right? The second one is you want to ensure that you have some provision for crimes against people, right? And what do I mean by crimes against people? I mean things like cyber stalking, online grooming, identity theft, human trafficking, financial fraud, and the list could go on and on and on and on, right? So it's crimes where the specific targets are people, but through a network device. So the next part is crimes against property. So you have things like cyber vandalism. I had a little tight on, apologies. Cyber vandalism, yes, right? So things like website defacement, those sorts of things which we have a good bit of in our region. Distributed denial of service attacks, which for the non-technical in the room, it means that you have a malicious actor taking over a large amount of computers and then telling those computers to send requests to this one particular system. And this one particular system is overwhelmed and just dies. All right, so that's why, you know, and then of course, transfer of harmful programs, so things like ransomware, et cetera, right? Now, you want to ensure that you have provisions for that. I like to ask questions in my presentation. So we learned what the 3 C's are, we learned what crimes against people are, we learned what crimes against property, so then what's crimes against institution? Reputation, but is that people somewhat? Reputation? My timekeeper going for the sheet, so we need to run quickly. So crimes against institution. What's that? National infrastructure. That's correct. So national infrastructure, things like cyber warfare, those sorts of things. And you want to put that again as crimes against institution. Next one is technical definitions. We all know the importance of the meaning of a word, more so in law, because the definition, for example, of a computer, if it doesn't include things like mobile devices, tablets, those sorts of things, then you would leave a lot of loopholes in your legislation. And you don't want to leave those loopholes. Now, it is very difficult for law, because of the process we have in the region, to go from thought to actual proclaimed law. That's a lengthy process. So it's not uncommon for legislation to lag behind technology, because technology doesn't have that holdback. However, you can think slightly forward, right? If you see something on the horizon, how does this fit in? Would it fit into my definitions? Is it specific? Is it wider? Those sorts of conversations and focal points you would need to do. International cooperation. Now, I've lumped things like criminal duplicity, your mutual legal exchange, all those kind of things in here. But what you want to do is ensure that in your legislation, it not necessarily mirrors somebody else's legislation, but your crimes are the same, right? Because that helps as I said before, because our products and services are not within the region, we do have to go out of the region most times to get information, and you want to be ensuring that whoever you're asking has the same laws on their books and categorized the same way. And of course, last but not least, enforcement, right? You need to have provisions within your legislation that gives the tools necessary to detect, investigate, and prosecute within your local jurisdiction. So the regional, at the regional level, what we have done in 2016, we sat down with our partners. Two of them are here today, CTU and the Commonwealth Secretariat. And we came up with this document, which was approved the year after by heads of government, which is the Cybersecurity and Cybercrime Action Plan. And within that plan, there are 5 priority areas that we focus activities under, and the framework under. So the 5 areas being public awareness, building sustainable capacity, technical standards and infrastructure, legal environment, and regional and international cooperation. And under the legal environment pillar, we have done 2 things at the regional level. So we have done a desk review of existing national legislation and policy frameworks within the member states, and comparing those against regional and the regional international standards. And we've also done regional cybercrime policy and legislative guidance documents to be developed. So to preempt the question that will follow is the reason we have not gone all the way to model law is because what we want to do is work directly with member states to see based on what they have on the books now, and to see how we can implement legislation that would, for now, cover the main areas and then make future plans. And what do I mean by that? In most of our jurisdictions, there is a Computer Misuse Act, and to make the fundamental changes or to bring new legislation into it, we would not, sometimes it may be tricky. So instead of trying to delay and get the best of both worlds, we are working to see what we can do now and then plan for the future. And how we're doing that is that we're working with the Council of Europe to hold country-specific workshops on building criminal justice capacities and on cybercrime, electronic evidence, and ascension to the Budapest Convention. Now, the Budapest Convention just recently has a new schedule, and what it does, it's an international framework by which countries can measure up their legislation to ensure that they cover those key areas. It also brings substantive technical assistance to member states, both in the ratification process, which is a 5-year process, and then the post-ratification process. So we are working directly with countries to bring that about. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I think my timekeeper, I am in time. I didn't get back the time I lost in the start, but that's another discussion. So I want to thank you for the short time that we spent together going through this. But the only thing I want to leave you with, if you remember nothing else I've said, is that remember the most important thing when we are going about developing our digital economies and all the auxiliary processes that come with it, is that the people, if the people do not trust what you're doing, we are doomed to fail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much in outlining that we are the cause of our own destruction. So on that note, I do see across the room that we have a few hands up. If I can start with the Secretary General and I can go across the room. I'm sure, thankfully, we now all have time to field the questions and close off on time today.
Yes, thank you very much, Anselm, for keeping us on track. And thanks for the very good presentation. CTU works closely with CARICOM Impacts because we of course, as he's rightfully said, the cybersecurity, if there's no trust and confidence, then people aren't actually going to use the systems. Impacts, which he didn't mention, is sort of an institution coming out of the Legacy of Cricket World Cup, which we hosted successfully in the region in 2007. And it is one of the mechanisms that remain to this day that I think successfully provides for the sharing of information across border, because we understand the importance of security, beyond even cybersecurity, security of the CARICOM space. But I wanted to know if, I'm not fully aware of what legislation at the national level enables impacts to share that information. I know it's obviously sensitive information in criminal intelligence and so on, but how are countries able to share that information under what specific legislative frameworks? And secondly, I'll just mention on the Cybercrime Action Plan, while it is a good one, I think unfortunately, and we were involved too in developing it, is the funds really to implement that. I think is something that CARICOM heads need to look at. As with all things, we have plans, but the actual financial resources to implement it is lacking. So that's the only unfortunate thing I would say about the plan, and we welcome our development partners like the ITU and others to help us in terms of assistance in moving that plan forward. Thank you.
I just want to just to respond to your two questions. I'll do the second one first. So I agree with you. The funds is always the issue, and we do have regional and international partners that do work along with us to implement activities under those priority areas. What I think is worth mentioning is that we are currently, now this plan was written in 2016, so it is a bit dated at this point, and we have started the initial process of reviewing that and then working together with, again, our partners to update the plan. So that is a work in progress. On the first question, and I didn't want to go too much into the sensitization aspect, but what allows the member states to share information through the agency is that we have a number of MOUs and MOIs and signed text or agreements between each member state and the agency that specifically dictates how we share that information, what we do with that information, and it governs our operations. So you have the intergovernmental agreement that would have established the agency that in 2006, and then subsequent to that, you have the MOUs and MOIs between the territories and the agency, as well as some of our partners that must be executed before we are able to share. And then because each member state is a sovereign state, there are additional safeguards, instructions that come under the scope of the SOPs that would determine how we share that information. So sometimes we would receive information and be told specifically what to do with that information. But we own none of the data. All our data is owned by the specific member states, and we serve those member states to basically assist in their operations, whether it be border services, intelligence, or cyber.
Excellent. Can I hand over to the Secretary General? I think I'm going between my Secretary Generals at this point of the ICC, who also has a question for you, Anselm, before you go to the left. Chris, your questions.
All right. Just a quick question. What do you make of, are you following the UN Cybercrime Convention? It's due to come into, well, due to be completed in 2024. From an industry perspective, we've got massive concerns about the scope of that convention. I'd just be really interested to know, one, if anybody's aware of it, and two, are you involved in it, or do you have any particular worries yourself?
Right, so yes, we are involved in it. We, as I said, we support our member states, and because our member states are involved, we then provide the necessary support that they require. So we are involved with it. I think it's a little bit remiss of me to comment on it at this point. It's a conversation we could probably have over the cocktails. However, I would say that the agency's position is not one or the other, all right, at this point. It's not mutually exclusive. If you go with the Budapest Convention, it does not mean if and when the UN process finishes that you can't sign on to that as well. But because the Budapest Convention is the established framework at this point, it, from a benefit perspective to our member states, we say, listen, let's work with this. We know that you have discussions with the UN Convention. We will support you in those discussions. And when that completes its course, then we can evaluate and help you along those lines as well. So it's not that we prefer one or the other. It's just that this is what we have now. We know what we need to do now. So we're using what we have now instead of waiting to the future.
Just to point out, I know that several CARICOM countries are involved in the OWEG process, and it's an iterative one. And we are involved in the consultation process because we see it as not being mutually exclusive, but ultimately complementary because they aim to achieve the same objectives, which is to create that global cybersecurity agreement or impact across the globe. But as Anselm had indicated, we're not in the nascent phases, but we're getting there, but that process will take time. I'm going to, before I go across the room, because I see some hands raised, if I could just put forward to you one of the questions raised by an online participant. Anselm, can you say whether there exists or is being developed by CARICOM impacts any regional guidelines or protocols to address the areas of technical, legal, and political responses for CARICOM member states regarding cyber diplomacy? That is, for cybersecurity breaches from states' jurisdictions external to CARICOM region, whether the state directly or entities, bodies sponsored or supported by a state.
That's a hard question. So the answer is yes. We are working. So it's part of, so we do have, as I said, policy and guidance documents as it relates to legislation. But on the flip side of that, we are starting to look at that. It's a work in progress. What we want to do is do it from a regional level. Currently, we're working one-to-one with member states. So when that request comes, we work directly with our member states. But we do have plans within the immediate future to come up with a regional type document that will give a general guidance along those lines. But we do recognize that we would still have to work one-on-one with states because of specific instances or specific nuances that happen within our region.
All right, I can finally hand over to the gentleman at the back who has a question as well.
Rodney Payne, Public Sector Modernization Program, Barbados. The building of trust. I have friends who know that I am pushing e-services, and even though I'm telling them that it's going to be safe, they're still skeptical because they're hearing the hackers breaking into the businesses and using the data. And then I say B, persons saying that they're being forced to use the technology because they don't want to stand in the long lines. So I have to take this risk in order for me to get my business done. What would you say? What recommendations do you say to these persons for these issues?
I think it goes back to the sensitization and how you sensitize. So one of the things when you're building a sensitization plan is what are the fears of the people? And then you determine how are you going to address those fears. So based on the kind of limited information on your question, I would have a conversation with them and say, okay, what are you afraid of? And then show them the safeguards that and I'm just using Barbados, that Barbados has to alleviate those fears, be it legislation, be it security in terms of infrastructure. You can have, let them talk to other people who, within their standings, to, get their reactions to the system, and then work from there. But sensitization is not just somebody coming up and say, well, the system is secure, and it means instead of 10 minutes, you'll now take 2. Because for some people, time is not an issue, right? It is. I remember doing some work with a specific member state, and one of the fears that was raised by a specific demographic was, this is the only time I get to come out of my house and interact with people, when they were launching a specific payment service, right? So you have to sit down and think, okay, how can I alleviate that fear? Do I have a center where I bring these people and they could still interact, but they can use the digital platform instead of doing it from home? You need to be creative. It's not an easy thing, and you will always have the naysayers. You will never convince 100% of the people. But once you have the majority, then you have that hive mentality, because people then say, well, no, why are you still doing this? We could do this quickly, and it makes your job a little easier.
Before we move on, I'm just going to raise one question from our virtual audience. This is from Tracy Hackshaw. Does the region, through CTU or impacts, keep an up-to-date critical infrastructure inventory?
You want to take that? I think, so at a regional level, coming out of one of our projects, we have a platform that we intend to do something like that. We have a central resource, of course, adequately secured and permissioned out, and that is one of the functions, to have this centralized resource where we can track not only critical infrastructure, but skill sets that in the event of something going wrong, to respond or assist within that sector. So, but for now, that platform should launch in a month's time, by the way. But for now, those lists are really held at the member state level. And I will say this, and I'm not throwing shade to any member state, but in some places we need to work on defining what critical infrastructure is. There are some places that there's no definition for that, whether in principle or legislation. So we are all at different places, but we are hoping with those one-on-one country consultations to get everybody to a common base, and then we work from there. Hope that answers the question. I think it's...
Thank you. I'll just say as well, because he asked about CTU. So the short answer from our perspective is no, and what you said is exactly right. My own experience working with the government of Barbados is that we had initiated a critical infrastructure identification and protection program. So let's start with identifying what is critical infrastructure, and not necessarily to keep inventory of the infrastructure, because it would be a significant, sizable database, but identify the providers of that infrastructure, whether it is the power grid or water, public health care, and so on, and then have regulations around that, governing how they are to protect their own infrastructures, how the power service providers, the telecoms providers, how are they in fact to keep an inventory of it, do audits, and are subject to cybersecurity tests, penetration testing and that kind of thing, in order to ensure that they are adhering to the regulation. So I think we have to start with actually identifying across the board what that critical, or who are the providers of critical infrastructure, and then have regulations that govern how they are to take care of that infrastructure. Thanks.
And the final question for this afternoon goes to the gentleman at the left.
Hi, my name is Anson Robinson, and I represent the Ministry of Financial Services of the Cayman Islands. Anson, sorry, that was a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Now, in your presentation, you showed a slide that reflected trust and how the trust has fallen off. But I believe that some of the distrust, it actually finds its roots in the response to a lot of the legislation that has been implemented to protect the same people. And part of that, I believe, is because some of the supporting legislation is viewed as being invasive, right? Getting into people's own, privacy, etc. What are some of the tools that you would suggest that we can implement to build back that trust? Because if we look, for example, at just an extension of that graph, that really it speaks to people's lack of trust in governments when it really boils down to it. What are some of the tools that you think that can be implemented to rebuild that trust that is so necessary? Because you've mentioned it throughout your entire presentation.
I think so. With any piece of legislation, especially cyber related or any legislation where to deliver some level of security, the people have to give up something, be it privacy, be it movement, any sort of thing. One of the key things is, and it goes back to sensitization, is sitting down and basically laying bare, listen, this is what we're trying to achieve, right? So I know in some jurisdictions, part of the drafting process is consultations. However, I think the consultations happen before you start to draft, and then you see this draft appear, and it's sometimes different to what the consultations are, and then you don't go back out and say, okay, this is what we've come up with, comment on this. And for whatever reason, that may be political, otherwise, you need to get this done by X time, etc. But it boils back down to having that conversation with people and understanding that people will make or break any system, any space, because if nobody's using it, if nobody trusts it, then it's all for naught. Yes, we can pass the legislation, but then there's a whole onslaught. So my simple thing is talk, consult, both pre-draft and the post-draft. Vashti, that's it?
Just one final comment, Anselm, and this would come from the Ministry of the Attorney General, Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Vashti. And to Anselm, that was a very good presentation. It's just in relation to what Chris was asking, if I may. So CARICOM is following very closely to the UN Convention. Mm-hmm. If you are as well, you would realize that CARICOM, headed by Jamaica has been voted to speak on behalf of us. So our 14 member states are well represented. We have positions on almost every part of the clusters for the fourth session. You may know that the new text was given to the group, I think it was November or December last year. So we're now working with the text, which we did, I think it was mid-January. So three main countries within CARICOM spearheading, and I would say Jamaica is leading, Guyana is co-chair, if I'm getting it right, and then you also have the others who pitch in to give our positions. So right now, if you looked at what happened in the last session, a lot of the stronger countries or bigger countries had stronger positions on like terrorism and so forth. And if it is that the UNTOC or the UNCAC actually takes care of the positions that they want to put in there, CARICOM is very open to further discussions on those items. However, we are methodically going through with the rest of the 193 countries, very methodically as to what our positions would be. There isn't anything final because in April, we go back to discuss the latter ones that deal with international cooperation, mutual legal assistance, and so forth. But CARICOM is very much so together with Impacts, following and participating. I actually have a working document I have to give responses to by tonight so that CARICOM could sit and put forward our positions before April comes up. So again, yeah, we could talk about it at the cocktail, but just to let you know, our eyes are on the convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very wonderful presentation and to the audience. At this point, I can hand over to the Secretary General of the CTU to make closing comments and remarks.
Thank you, Vashti. Good afternoon. As we close, I see we're just about on the dot for close-up, so I'm now the one between you and Barbados. And since I'm a Barbadian, I would make that time very short. So let me thank you for sticking around. Before I forget, there is an evaluation link on our website. You should also have received an email with an evaluation link. We'd like you to do that for day one, and if you haven't received it, please go to ctu.int, click on the banner that says Effective Legal Frameworks, and you'll see there is Event Evaluation button on there where you have overview, agenda, etc. You'll see it there, right? There is a cocktail reception at 6 p.m. and we are all invited, so we'd love for you to stick around for that, those of you who are not staying on the property. And of course, those of you who are, it'll be right outside this room. I don't know if any additional details will be provided, but food and drinks just outside here at 6 to 8 p.m. And to our online participants, I'm not sure how many we have right now, but they've been very active in the chat, posing questions and being very attentive, and we really appreciate you as well. A very special thanks to our sponsors, the Caribbean Development Bank, the Financial Services Commission, the Central Bank of Barbados, Z-Money, and we want to thank MIST as well for giving us support in hosting this event. Really appreciate the support that MIST and all the other sponsors have been able to give to us. So we started off today very early with some very engaging remarks from our Attorney General. We're really happy that he took the time to speak with us today about the importance of legislation in driving policy and protecting consumers. We're also honored to have the Attorney General from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it shows you, I guess, the level of importance that they have placed on this particular topic, and the understanding that they have in how it enables the development of digital economies, which is the essence of our workshop here today. There has been a great deal of media interest in the remarks made by the Attorney General, and we anticipate some news stories this evening and tomorrow, and for the rest of the week coming out of this workshop. Other speakers today, of course, focus on various topics, such as measuring the digital economies by the UN Capital Development Fund with a focus on inclusiveness, in particular using fintech and other technologies, e-money, to bridge the digital gap and to be inclusive. A very engaging presentation as well on intellectual property. Of course, that is one of the foundational pieces of building a digital economy. How do you protect people's intellectual property and ensure that they are free to share and thrive in this new digital environment without the fear of piracy or theft, intellectual property theft. We had also very engaging panel discussion on fintech and regulatory sandboxing as opposed to sandbagging. And we're very pleased that we were able to have a presentation from the CEO of or participation of the CEO of the Financial Services Commission, which is one of our sponsors, John Outridge from a remote participant from Trinidad and Tobago International Financial Center, and Felicity, who is the country manager for Z-Money, one of the new mobile money providers here in Barbados, and who is trying to do business in the Caribbean. And you heard some of the challenges that they have and the need for these sandboxes that allow these companies to operate or play in the market, as it were, without doing any harm to consumers. Very engaging discussion as well from the Caribbean Competition Commission, from Navia. Navia, I always have difficulty pronouncing. And yes, promoting competition within the Caribbean, fair and open competition, and how do we deal with companies that are not necessarily, that they're doing business here in the region, but they're not registered here. Big tech companies in particular is of concern, especially as they play within the ICT industry space. And unfortunately, as her slide showed, that there are still many member states who don't really have strong competition legislation, and I think that's a gap that we really need to bridge. The telecoms legislative frameworks, presentations from the Telecoms Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. We heard about the Universal Service Fund and how that could be leveraged, how they are leveraging it to bridge the digital divide in Trinidad. And we see that in Trinidad's case, the use of the USF is a good solution for helping us to do that, and is a good model which we can emulate. The last presentation from our own Ansem Charles from the CARICOM Impacts, an agency with which we work very closely at the CTU on you heard about the regional cybersecurity plan, the importance of trust in these systems for citizens to uptake these services, some of the challenges that they face on a daily basis, and I'm well aware as well of the resource constraints, in particular when we talk about cybersecurity and cybercrime. Impacts deals with a number of traditional security issues, guns and drugs and all of these different things. So cybersecurity falls somewhere in that spectrum, and there's a need, I know, for additional resources to bring to bear if we are to fight this global problem. You will be receiving more extensive reports. The sessions are recorded, and we have rapporteurs that will help us. And in terms of developing the final outcomes from the workshops, but this was just a recap for today. Tomorrow promises to be very engaging. I am chairing a panel. I'm chairing a panel tomorrow. So if you miss everything else, make sure. Come for that one. But no, they're all very, very engaging. We have Sophie Maddens presenting tomorrow, all the way from the International Telecommunications Union, and several other very engaging speakers. So thank you for your time and attention. Is there any other housekeeping matters? Okay, I see a hand though. Yes.
One question is, how do we get access to the slides? Like, is there something specific we need to do to get access to all the presentations?
Right, so there is, let me just see, presentations. There is a presentation link on our website, so we will make every effort to have those uploaded to you, for you, at least by tomorrow, right? Probably in PDF format. So on the same ctu.int, click on events, you'll see the banner for this workshop, and all of the related documents should be there as well. Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank you. Thank you, Vashti, as well, for excellent facilitation today. I think she deserves a round of applause. And now I will release you to enjoy some of Barbados and invite you to be back here for 6 p.m. Thank you very much.